Welcome to the Wild Ag Podcast, where we'll serve as a connection point for landowners and conservation professionals who want to integrate conservation and agriculture. I'm Dr. Andrew Little, Professor of Landscape Ecology and Habitat Management and Extension Specialist at the University of Nebraska.
And I'm Nate Pfluger, Precision Ag Coordinator for Pheasants Forever and an avid outdoorsman with friends and family in my free time. Together, we'll work to bring you perspectives from both landowners and conservation professionals for discussions on soil, water, and wildlife in ag-dominated landscapes.
Welcome back to the Wild Ag Podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Little. I'm here with my co-host, Nathan Pfluger. And today we have the great honor of having Dr. Larkin Powell, the Director of the School of Natural Resources, joining us. Dr. Powell, do you want to give a little introduction about yourself?
Sure. It's great to be here with you guys. Thanks for the invitation to join you. I'm serving right now as the Director for the School of Natural Resources here at UNL on East Campus. The school has about 85 faculty, and we deal in everything from climate, water, and soil to the biodiversity end of things. So I know that you all cover almost that entire spectrum on this show. So that's great. A lot of folks in the school that can help the folks of Nebraska and beyond. My background, I grew up in southern Iowa on a farm, was in 4-H a lot. That was kind of the big thing I did as a youth, and that led me to want to work on a 4-H camp. I worked for the Iowa 4-H camp and wanted to be a vet. Went to school, figured out my sophomore year that there was this thing called ecology, that you could actually get paid for doing what I was teaching at the 4-H camp on the nature staff, and so that kind of turned me away. Figured out I didn't maybe want to stitch up the things and make sure things were alive. So just deal with things out in their natural environment was what I wanted to do. So went on to grad school, worked for 3 years. Part of my grad school, Andy, we got a connection because it was down at the University of Georgia. That's right. Where I did my last grad school bit. Then came back to Iowa. The University of Dubuque for 3 years was my first teaching job. And then over here, since 2001, I've been a wildlife faculty member here, and just in 2023 became the director. So in the 22 years, if calculations are correct, that's a lot of bird related, but not always, but a lot of habitat related things. So pheasants, a lot of prairie chicken work up in the sandhills, grassland birds, grazing systems, what grazing systems are better, if any, for grassland birds. So a lot of work on private lands, and I think that feeds into what you all do with this podcast as well. So
yeah, well, absolutely. We really appreciate you joining us today, and that's actually what we're going to talk a little bit about today is conservation in our working landscapes and tying that into some of your background. And then we can highlight at the end, you have an upcoming book coming out.
Sure.
And talk a little bit about that. So jumping into this a little bit, so the big picture, really thinking about our landscape across the United States, is we have a lot of private land. Obviously, you get some of our western states like Utah and Montana and Idaho. We have more public lands in there, but a lot of our states we are comprised of private land. So conservation, therefore, is going to be tied to those private lands. Obviously, got a lot of different landowners, decision makers that are out there. And so I really think, today we're going to talk a lot about how conservation can work on those private lands. And obviously, it really can't succeed successfully in the absence of involvement with those landowners. We have to be able to work directly with them to be able to implement conservation practices and understanding a lot of the constraints that many of like Nebraska, the landowners are facing from a production ag side of things. So we'll kind of go through kind of like a past, maybe present, and then a future. And so we'll kind of start with the past and kind of the foundations. So can you kind of reflect on, some just the general history of, conservation working landscapes? I know you've written some papers on that and talked about thinking about World War I and II and kind of that process
Sure.
with Hitler and the kind of the change in our landscapes, and just kind of talk through that process from the past and kind of where that'll eventually lead into our present situation.
Sure. No, that's actually we might as well start plugging this book as soon as we can, right? But,
Sure.
But that's the format of what I've been trying to do from a scholarly standpoint there, is to look at kind of what's the history of our land use in Nebraska as a representative of the heart of the Great Plains. And so even just a step back from that to think that, less than 200 years ago, there was a completely different people that was on our landscape. Within a fairly short amount of time, those people were replaced with a different people, and the main herbivore was replaced as well. So a real dramatic, that's kind of with the exception of the entrance of humans into the Great Plains at some point, 15,000 years ago, the removal of those people is a big change, and the removal of that herbivore, the bison that went with them, big change. So then you think about those early settlers developing farms and farmsteads, starting to take advantage of this resource here in the Great Plains. And right before the Dust Bowl, that was actually the highest. If you look at the acres farmed in Nebraska, acres under the plow, if you want to call it that, we hit a high point that we've never gotten back to right before the Depression and the Dust Bowl come along. So the late 1920s, we'd probably gone a little too far in like marginal land use, right?
Sure.
And we've never gone back to that. So that's kind of an interesting thing. Depression and Dust Bowl come along, so we've got a climatic, a big drought that lasts for a long time with and you didn't have to be in the Great Plains to be experiencing the Great Depression. So you've got this dynamic really worldwide, but we focus here on the United States. And so there was a lot of farmers that were hurting. And the thing that I think is interesting when we think about our current farm bills and kind of the advent of those is that Roosevelt and his Secretary of Agriculture, Henry Wallace, were trying to figure out how to get payments to farmers, because at that time farmers were still an important voting bloc. Now, not that they're not an important voting bloc, they were a greater percentage of the population back then. And so they tried essentially just giving them some money through I think it was called the Agriculture Adjustment Act in the early 30s. We're going to, let's say 32 or 33. And that actually got struck down. That was kind of, in our present day, that would be kind of like some people's reaction to Obamacare, where people were like, why are we giving all these money to all these people? So there was a lot of reaction in Congress, and they actually went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said you can't just give people tax money that has been gathered from other people to another. You can't just shift money around like that, right? Like, why didn't you give it to people that make dresses? Or, right?
Sounds like they're kind of buying votes.
Right. I mean, seriously. So that's pretty much what the Supreme Court said. And so, but that's the beauty, the workaround, I call it, is that they decided that they could use conservation as the means to get money to farmers. And so the way that they did that was that in a subsequent bill, you get money if you implement conservation practices that save soil or water, and that's a public good. And so now we're giving money to a group of people, but they're performing a good for the rest of us by saving the soil, keeping the water, saving water and keeping it pure. And so now you've got your first farm bill, essentially. And so the federal government is on the private lands in a way that they had never been before. And we've subsequently had several other iterations of that, including and so that's basically led to our current farm bill, which provides money to farm and ranchers in return for conservation programs that they implement on their farm.
Sure. Yeah, no, and that's interesting because it's like I've always thought like there's really kind of two options. You can either have a mandate or you can have this voluntary incentive program, which is what we have. And obviously being able to incentivize producers to be able to put in conservation practices, as you mentioned, to help improve soil quality and address soil erosion issues and water quality and things like that. So, yeah that's really interesting.
So you mentioned in the 1920s, that's when we reached the highest point of acres under the plow. Where are we at today compared to that high point in the 20s?
Well, we're below that. We're not incredibly below that. So I'm going to say percentage-wise, we're probably maybe 90% of that, maybe 8 to 10% below where we were then. But that's another thing that's always interesting to me is that I think maybe the general population thinks that every year farmers put a little bit more under the plow, because we hear about like grasslands being taken up to plant crops, and that does happen. But a lot of those grasslands might have previously been crops, and then they were put back into CRP or something, and then now they're going back to crops. But that essentially by 1920, according to our statistics here in Nebraska, we had as much we had as much cropland as we do today. And then it went up a little bit higher right before the Dust Bowl. But really, for literally 100 years, we've had about as much farmland being farmed in Nebraska as we do. And so things, there's little twitches through time as farming is more profitable or less profitable. But that is thinking about 100 years as the time that we've really, those early American European settlers did their job, and they got the land under the plow pretty quickly.
Which is a pretty amazing feat, thinking about the technology that they had then versus what they have today. That they could convert a lot of that over. That's just an incredible effort. So
Yeah, and so I mean, the main driver of those ups and downs that we see is obviously commodity prices, right? Is there any other major factor outside of commodity prices?
I think that's the main factor, because commodity values tend to drive land values too. And so, and then you can go back to then what are the kind of world dynamics and continental dynamics that affect commodity prices, but which can get complicated. But I think commodity prices really are and markets being which commodities, because that's another interesting thing in Nebraska through time is we started with corn, oats, and wheat as the first three. That's what people were planting in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Then we started to diversify. You get your barley and your oats and other sorghum and other things in there. And then in the 70s, here comes soybeans into the picture. And so things go and come, but each one of those has to do with the soybeans make their appearance later. I know I'm getting ahead of the story here, but that's a good example of a market, right? You've got an export market that is driving people to change their equipment and do something that they hadn't been doing on their farms. And so I think we can think about that when it comes to conservation too, because it's not like people don't change what they're doing on their farms. They do it in response to those markets and economic incentives.
No, that's really cool. Yeah, and thinking about it, I can't remember what publication you had, but I remember you had some imagery in there where you showed photos from back in the 30s and then kind of in the 60s and then current. And it was really interesting to see, because one of the things that, universally I always get the question is like, well, nothing's really changed in the landscape. And we know things have changed. And the thing I always say is that a lot of these changes may be incremental, and we don't necessarily see that. So like if you're driving down the same section of road every day, you may not see that those, for example, say cedar trees that are expanding, or, that vegetation is changing over time. But obviously succession is occurring, and for those plant communities, versus, oh, hey, I see dozers showing up and they're building a Walmart parking lot kind of thing. Like, that's a pretty dramatic change. I think a lot of the times we just don't see that stuff that fast. So we just assume that it's not really changing. But in reality, your photos clearly showed, that the landscape has dramatically changed. And you just mentioned the crops.
Yep.
That being one of them. You went from very small fields. You had multiple crops in there, and one of your publications shows that.
Highly
And you see
diverse.
that,
Yep.
yeah, you start seeing that drop off over time, which is, I don't think, a surprise to most folks when you drive around out here in Nebraska and a lot of your other Midwestern states. And again, that goes back to that commodity market-driven effort,
Sure.
where a lot of those changes have come from.
Yep.
So, yeah.
And I've never met one of these people, but I think it would be fun. Apparently, there is a field of study called landscape perception, which is kind of a psychological, social science combined with environmental interests, and they say exactly what you're describing, that long-term changes are difficult for us to process as people because we're hardwired to think about what thing with teeth is chasing us as cave folks, and so we're interested in here and now.
Yeah.
And so, but yeah, things like cedar trees growing or a few fields changing over time don't kind of enter. And I've actually had, when I've given some presentations about some of these crop changes, I've had some producers even say, well, I don't think we've seen that kind of change in my county. And then I've sent them like, okay, here's the ag changes for your county, because you can get that from the USDA.
Sure.
And they'll be like, oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it is like I've even been challenged on like, well, I don't think our county has changed all that much in the last 80 years, and oh, well, actually it has. So
Yeah.
So that's interesting to think about. I think some people think about that even with like national parks and non-private lands, but that someday I'll meet a landscape perception scientist. And
that would be really cool
we'll
to
have a good conversation.
Yeah, that'd be really cool. But I do get that question a lot, and we share that out in our social media. We actually had a post here a couple months ago where we had a little series of photos, a little slider bar, and you can go back and forth and look at the differences from the 50s to current.
Yep.
And it was really helpful because it's really, I even zoomed in down here to, Lincoln and looking at O Street and to see that, where, you have Best Buy at, all that, those were ag fields, obviously, at one point. Especially back in the 50s, but now obviously, they're all in, commercialized properties at this point. And so, things change. And I think, it's back to that, instantaneous. You see those major changes, or is it this kind of slow kind of burn, if you want to say, and you see those changes very slowly on the landscape. And I have found when you talk to some individuals like, oh, well, hey, yeah, that hedgerow is gone now. I've seen that now. And it's like, but again, it's that, perceptions. That would be kind of cool to talk to somebody like that.
Well, and I think that's useful if we try to think of providing that information. One of our roles here at the university, whether it's sharing the landscape photos or the kind of the habitat dynamics or population dynamics of the species that we're interested in, just in terms of decisions that landowners are making.
Oh, absolutely.
Too, because all that information is useful. And if you've got the wrong impression, then you're not as informed as you should be to make a decision on your farm or ranch.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So when those early conservation programs rolled out to kind of combat the issues of the Dust Bowl, what was the government, what practices were they paying landowners to implement? Yeah,
well, so one of the interesting ones, I think I make a statement get ahead of myself there. They had a list of like approved crops and what do we say? It was like good crops and bad crops, essentially, from a soil and water standpoint. And so corn was not a priority crop. So if you were planting corn, fine, but you're not going to get any government funding for it. So the list of the good crops that you could get payments for if you planted those on your farm, essentially, if we take your Pheasants Forever perspective here, would probably be exactly the crops that you would list that would help wildlife. And those were good because they didn't take a lot of water and they held the soil. So sorghum, wheat, oats, all these small grains, essentially. Hay was on there. So you essentially they were splitting up by crop types. So that it wasn't to convert. It wasn't like our current CRP program where we were converting to grasslands, but it was encouraging people to plant specific crops. And in the process of doing that, it also created a market, because now you're reducing how much corn is being planted out there. So corn prices edge up a little higher. And so you're kind of playing around with how much people are planting certain crops, and they were trying to reduce some of those major crops. But so the statement in the book is like, you couldn't make a better list for today's conservation of the crops that we would encourage out on the landscape than they did back in the early 1930s for this early conservation program.
Yeah.
That's interesting because, I mean, as Pheasants Forever, specifically within my position, I mean, I'm going out there, like you mentioned, trying to get producers to diversify their crop rotation away from just corn and soybeans.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we actually have incentives and foregone income payments if they are willing to bring winter wheat, cereal, rye back into the crop rotation. So it's crazy that we're still kind of struggling against that same battle, or fighting that same battle.
No,
I guess.
I think it's so good to go from that historical perspective and kind of have as your foundation to kind of see where we've been, and even before, the 1900s, and thinking about that kind of transition of our landscapes, and thinking a little bit about, like, thinking about Aldo Leopold. We had, that's in his book, he talks about this in a couple of different books that he has in the 30s, thinking about late 20s, early 30s, that, he was having a lot of the same conversations that we're still having today. And so then you can say, well, have we made progress? Well, sure, we have made progress. But, a lot of those same conversations are still persistent today around how do we, and a lot of it, again, economic driven, and how do we adjust and kind of address some of those challenges today, maybe more innovatively with new technologies like precision ag technologies and things like that. So, yeah.
No, I think some of in his day, maybe this was like a new idea that he was trying to get into things. Today, we are still using that theme of, like, there's two different types of people out there, or other themes that he had, and we realize that that's still important to kind of refine what we're doing for landscapes, but we've made progress since those days. But it is still those same underlying kind of human tendencies, human nature to look for short-term success, to feed our family and make sure that we've got shirts on everybody's back, that drive us forward, which are very understandable from from that human tendency standpoint.
Absolutely. I think that's also one of the things when Nathan and I started this podcast, we wanted to really emphasize that landowner perspective, in which we've had landowners on, because I think it's so important that others out there can learn a little bit about, what the decision making that they're going through, because it is very complex. And it's not just like I get up and everything's just going to work perfectly for me today. Like, no, we got a lot of these variables that we can't control, like the weather, for example. And so there's going to be a lot of potential things that come up during the day or during a season that they're going to have to address, and that's a lot of extra stress on their plate of trying to figure that out. And then also simply things like, I'm not necessarily getting a paycheck every 2 weeks, because I'm having to think about, planting and then eventually harvesting, and then I'll get money out of that. So it's been really helpful, I think, to also bring that perspective onto the podcast, because I think that's kind of getting, a landowner's view of, like, what are they dealing with? And ultimately, that's one of the things we've strived together, is if we ultimately want to advance conservation and working landscapes, we have to have, and it's kind of all hands on deck perspective, and we have to have multiple partners, landowners, ag industry, conservation professionals, all working together to solve these complexities. It can't just be one group or another. We all have to work together. So,
Yeah. No, I agree. I call it the dad test. My dad, he just retired a couple years ago from farming, and he was a farm consultant. He had an ag econ background, and he helped farmers starting during the farm crisis. He helped people save their farms, but he's helped them look at what they're doing that's making them money and what they're doing that's not making them money, and make better decisions in that regard. And so a lot of times whenever I had an idea, I'd put it by him. And if Ray Powell said it was a good idea, then I could go forward with it. So that was, I think there's a little beauty in that, of kind of gut checking yourself, however that is. Not everybody has Ray Powell to pass things by, but yeah, that's to your point. I think it's important that we do that.
Yeah.
Without a doubt. So how did we move from having that good and bad list of crops to what farmers can take advantage of today, like the CRP program and things like that? Sure.
Well, and so I'll answer that with a little longer answer and a short answer. Soil bank was the next major innovation that came along in the 1950s. And that actually did have people planting things back to grass and things. So that was an innovation, that it wasn't just about crop types, but that's when those years are when, pheasants went crazy in South Dakota, North Dakota. I think there's some data that was collected in South Dakota that pretty much gets used in every wildlife textbook that shows like just pheasants going out the wazoo and the counts in South Dakota during this soil bank period. And then eventually in the 80s, you get this, the Conservation Reserve Program kind of, I guess, formalizes that a little bit more, and some other programs like EQIP and the CSP come along over time. So, but the thing you'll notice there is, essentially, if you go from late 20s, where the economic situation downturns in the United States, to the 1950s, to the 1980s, there's 30 years in between each one of those. And if you look at land values in the United States, and what I've made some graphs, the way I look at them graphically, because it's hard to just look. Land values have gone up. If you want to invest in land, it's still a good idea, I think. Most farmers would tell you that, I think. You just got to be patient and wait a while. But if you can look at the graph, land values look like they just keep going up and up. There's some little blips in there. Well, the blips are important, because if you take a look at the land value today as a percentage of the land value 10 years ago, so essentially, if that is less than 100%, that means land value is less today than it was 10 years ago. If it's greater, and a lot of times it's a lot greater, then we're doing good from an investment perspective in our farmland. So, guess where the dips are. If you kind of plot that out, you get these cycles, and it was crazy when I did that the first time. I'd never seen it plotted that way before. But we talk about boom and bust cycles in farming. Well, I looked at it and I was like, holy cow, there they are right there. That's our boom and bust cycles. And so essentially using land values as the guide to when things are good and when they're bad. The Great Depression shows up as a really big dip. Things are less than 100%. The 1950s, it dips again. So they zipped up after World War II. Land values went up. And then in the 1950s, they came back down. They were still over 100%, but there was a significant dip. And so some people were getting caught where they'd made an investment and now their farm wasn't worth as much anymore. So that was still a problem if you wanted to sell your farm. And so that's an interesting thing, that both of those time periods are when innovations happened in conservation. And then we go to the farm crisis of the 1980s, and they actually dipped down below 100% again in the 1980s. Another innovation in conservation. And so it's not a prediction. My thesis here is that those are time periods where there's political will to address a problem out on rural America for farmers. Mm-hmm. And so just like Roosevelt did during the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, they did the same thing again with the Soil Bank program in the 1950s and then Conservation Reserve Program in the 1980s. which has started our. Now the interesting thing is that we're now at we bottomed out or not, but you're starting to hear that land values are going down as commodities are not doing the greatest in some places, or in many places, and so we're starting to dip again. The prediction is that we're probably not going to slide under 100%, but we're in a little bit of a dip. I'm not sure. Politics in Washington may be clouding this issue more than it did during the last 3 times where land values have fallen. But you could. I'm just interested to see whenever we get a new farm bill, will it have some innovative practices in it that kind of mark a new path forward for conservation? Because the prediction would be that we would at some point here. Now, I've been saying that since 2013 when it looked like we were cresting and things were going to start sliding, and they did keep sliding, but we still haven't got a new farm bill that was much more different than it was in the past. So, but we'll see what happens maybe in this next farm bill or the one after that. But that's I told you there was going to be a long answer to your question there.
That was a great answer. And of course, it sparked another question for me here quick. So when they rolled out the soil bank in the 1950s and that program was returning acres back to grass, was that mainly, again, to just get money to producers' hands, or was that a way to try to control the commodity crop production?
The latter.
Okay.
And maybe both, but it was to try to get corn prices and wheat and corn prices back up higher again.
So essentially, produce less, your prices go
right.
up.
They were overproducing, and kind of the same general thing happened in the 1980s. Where in the 70s there was all these the Russian grain deals and a lot of things that had really propelled people to fence row farm and produce, and commodities went up and people bought land, and then all of a sudden by the early 1980s there was overproduction and commodity prices fell and land values fell, and all of a sudden that was so we just do. It's like it's crazy. Like there's nothing out there that says, "Hey, folks, it's been 30 years and it's time for another farm crisis." But it is just interesting how I guess an economist would probably tell me I'm smoking something, but it's that it's like human nature runs in these 30-year cycles, and
That's interesting.
so we take advantage for short-term. We want a short-term advantage. Corn prices are going high. I'm going to plant corn. Well, guess what? Your neighbors did too. And so maybe that works for 3 or 4 years, but eventually corn prices go back down. And so you're trying to, people are, they're trying to the people in DC are trying to watch that as they monitor these programs and allow different allotments of acres and things like that. So,
well, yeah, and I'm sure there's somebody way smarter than me looking into this, but what is the sweet spot over all these years that we've been tracking? I mean, booms and busts. There's got to be somewhere in the middle where if we're just like, hey, guys, let's calm down. Let's have this much in habitat and let's farm this much. But, I mean, can you speak to that at all?
Well, I mean, I think that you may be in a sweet spot, but then something like somebody will say there's a new grain deal that happens or something where there's a market that's opened up for us, and so that disturbs the present situation, and in some cases that's seen as that's a good thing, right? I mean, I think technology can do that too. The advent of different technologies can change how we're doing things and what we're doing on the landscape. So yeah, I mean, there certainly are. You could probably look at times that were kind of before we got before land values went too high,
Sure.
but how do you slow that
Yeah,
down?
you can't predict the future. It seems like it obviously comes down to the economics 101, supply and demand, and
Yeah.
and if that demand is a lot higher, then they're going to take up the supply to
Yep.
be able to meet that demand. And as you mentioned, I think that's the challenge is you're trying to predict things of the future. You don't know when different deals come up, and this country now wants to utilize corn or whatever for
Right.
X, Y, and Z, they hadn't done in the past, or they have a bigger demand, and we need to maximize production.
Right.
So that's the harder part, which, of course, as you get to learn a lot about I've been reading more on that, and just kind of the complexities of all these aspects for not only from producer, but then even the conservation programs, because I've had folks, well, why do we have so many different programs? I'm like, well, east to west across the country, we have a lot of diversity in our lands, and we have a lot of different resource needs, and that's why they've developed a lot of these programs to meet those needs.
Yep.
It's been it's an interesting process. So that's good. So thinking about kind of the transition a little bit from the past to the present, and thinking about obviously CRP, as you've been noting, is one of the primary programs out there that's available. There's obviously a lot of different programs under that umbrella of CRP. That's helped obviously slow the decline, for example, of certain wildlife species out there. And you actually have a paper on that, I believe tied to pheasants, if I'm not mistaken. And thinking about, that's helping to kind of, plug that hole in the boat, but that's obviously not going to fix that hole. Like that's going to be a component there. And so one of the things I've been thinking about in kind of our current situation as we continue to get, more and more fragmented, just realistically on the landscape. And obviously, with the allocations of CRP that are available, it's not like we have like unlimited money out there that can go everywhere. And so we have to kind of prioritize that. And that's what FSA and NRCS can help with. But moving forward and kind of thinking about or in our current situation, how do we kind of think about, we have CRP as a program, but are there other opportunities that you've seen out there, globally, or how others potentially are, thinking about in our current landscape about addressing conservation and working landscapes? Are there other programs that other countries are using or other initiatives that people are using currently that you're aware of? Or I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah. No, I mean, so I'll maybe pull out a couple. In 2009, our family had the opportunity to go to Namibia in Southern Africa for a year through the Fulbright program. And so I taught at a university there, which is a great experience, and got to kind of through the students' eyes and the faculty's eyes there and other conservation people in the country that I met, kind of see a whole different model for conservation. And they don't have, it's a developing nation. It's a country that doesn't have a lot of resources. They don't have a farm bill program, for example. They just don't have the resources to use incentive programs like that. But what they do have is a lot of safari hunting and nature watching and that sort of thing that they know people like to come to Southern Africa, and they're going to try to be the number one destination. So a lot of farmers, they call them farmers, we would call them ranchers. Most of Namibia is some kind of grassland. It's so dry that they don't do a lot of row crop in Namibia, but they will have lodges. They'll make little cabins for people, and so as a diversifying factor to reduce their risk as a rancher farmer, they will have ecotourism in many cases, not all, but lots of people have gravitated that way. So you could label that under private investment. So
Sure.
rather than having federally tax incentives, tax-derived incentives, there's private investment. And I think if you look to the United States, there's a fair bit of that going on around as well, with more people living in cities that are disconnected from rural areas, but still have a desire, at least on the weekend, to get back out and
Sure.
experience it, right? So,
Sure,
you could
yeah.
think of the classic dude ranch, but there's now, ranches out west that you can go visit and stay for a week and see kind of agro-tourism, ecotourism. There's examples there's every month during crane season, it seemed like I was learning of another place that was leading prairie chicken tours and crane tours, kind of a combination there out along in western Nebraska along the Platte River Valley. And so I think that's a model.
Sure.
That is something that we can't ignore. We have a different system here, but I think it's an interesting one to think about. Private investment driving conservation, but it has to figure out, just like everything else we've been talking about, it has to pencil out at the bottom line economically for the family. And then in the UK, where I had another chance to spend a little bit of time, they do have a farm bill type program that they use, but they're doing things that I know, Andy, you're familiar with, these kind of beetle bank areas that are kind of like little prairie strips that go through their field. But the idea is you put in this fairly narrow strip of not crops, but very, very forb intense areas. And then the insects, beetles especially, that are in there actually help the farmer by reducing the need for pesticide near that bank by eating critters that are harming the crops. So I think there's a lot of different ways that people are, and I think it's good for us to be looking around at other models around the world.
And that's kind of what I was getting at, is like, we obviously have a lot of challenges currently. And so just trying to think about, other models that others are, implementing across the world that potentially could, apply here.
Yep.
And I think that's helpful for listeners out there who are, thinking about how can I really, optimize my operation? How can I think about maybe new ideas to develop? I kind of think a lot about it. It's like it's like a stackable enterprise approach. So you have kind of your base income coming from, say corn or soybeans or ranching. And then you think about, hey, what other opportunities can I stack on top of that to help optimize my operation?
Yep.
And, think about ways that you can do that can also ensure that legacy of that land, sustaining those natural resources for future generations. So one other thing I was curious about, and just kind of thinking, with the current working landscapes that we have, based on some of your past research, based on just conversations you've had, across Nebraska and, Midwest, and even globally, what are some of the major barriers from your perspective that are, potentially hindering that process we talked obviously about markets. I think that's probably a big one. But I'm just kind of curious if you have any other thoughts on, potential barriers that may, facilitate or really, I should say, constrain, a producer's, ability to really, implement some conservation practices.
Sure. I'll throw out a couple. One kind of has to do with landscape design, and the greatest example of that is the center pivot in Nebraska. So
sure.
if you're gonna invest in irrigation and a center pivot, you're basically saying that in this quarter section or whatever this pivot covers, I'm going to make this. Usually, it's a homogeneous field, so that's like all corn underneath that pivot, right? And you've invested in the well, you've invested in the pump, you've invested in the pivot, and that's not cheap. And so now you think about a farmer that has a whole bunch of those across their operation, and you show up on their land to talk about conservation, and you want to suggest that maybe one of those 80 acres gets turned back to grass, and they're like, I made this huge investment about 5 or 6 years ago to buy new center pivots and everything. So I think kind of knowing where people are with their investments and that's a big factor and that's in the western parts of the state. The other thing I'd say, there's a framework that I'll get to call out a colleague here, Tanya Haig, who's in our National Drought Mitigation Center. When I saw her give a talk once, she had this, she's a social scientist, human dimension scientist, and she thinks about how people make decisions, which is what you asked. And so she has this risk and adaptive capacity framework. And so when she's talking about this framework for whether ranchers will take steps to mitigate against drought, that was her work. I'm looking at like that framework and how that applies to conservation, and for wildlife and habitats. And so the two parts of it are that everybody has risk, and you have this even if you're not a farmer. Think about, like, I've got a got a little yard at my house.
Sure.
So if somebody comes up to me and says, would you like to put in a prairie instead of a yard, I'm going to start thinking, well, like, what's the risk to me
Sure.
as the landowner? So same thing if you go to a rancher and say, would you like to do a prescribed burn on their land? They're going to be like, well, they'll have a pretty big list of what those risks are, right? And so then on the flip side is their capacity to deal with and implement that, or their perceived capacity to do that. Like, they may be let's just take my dad right now. He's in his 80s. There's no way that he's going to be out there fighting a fire, doing a prescribed burn and helping with that. He's going to need some help.
Sure.
And so that's where, like, a local fire department that says, sure, we'll come out and help with that can increase your perception of your ability to implement that policy. And so this idea of risks and that people might be worried about and their capacity to deal with it, I think are things that we can work with as NGOs, agencies, university to and so a great example of the risk part is our project up at Barter Brothers Ranch right now here in Nebraska, where we've got a demonstration of a patch burn grazing thing where the university is taking on the risk of doing this to show people, is there going to be good weight gain in the cattle the year after you do that fire? Well, that's a lot of people's number one risk. If you say, they're like, well, you're taking away some of my forage, I'm pretty sure. And my cows have to gain weight.
Yeah, sure.
And so the university's showing that apparently so far it shows that they're actually doing pretty well. So I think thinking about things like that in terms of people's risks and their capacities to deal with it, I could probably even put that example I started with the center pivots under the risks category. It's like, well, how am I going to recoup my investment that I just made? Am I going to, sure, I like grass, I like to hunt. Am I going to get enough from the lease for CRP to still pay off this center pivot that I just bought,
Yeah. And I think that's a really good point of where extension can help out as well from the university side and being able to get some of that information out, because that you mentioned like leasing or just, even just general information. You mentioned the cattle, like that's stuff that is really important that producers are coming to the university saying, hey, this is a huge issue. We can't, this is a big risk, as you noted. If we're going to make this decision for our operation, I need some more definitive information to really say that, that risk is going to be lowered because of, I have actual data to suggest that. To me, that's also a little plug for the on-farm research network that UNL has, is a really great way to think about that for landowners that are out there that, hey, I have some ideas, but I actually would like to do it on my property. I would like to see what happens on my property. You can partner with the university and you can actually do that, and they can do all kinds of experimental trials out there. And so I'm kind of diving a little into that with some current research opportunities on the conservation front, knowing that that's a really cool arena to get into for producers. So yeah, that's a great point.
Well, and where there's a lot of good on-farm research going on, there's relationships in place. And I think that's something that's often overlooked when we're working with landowners out on the landscape. If you just roll up in a pickup and say, hey, I want to turn that quarter to grass, they're going to tell you to get out of here. But I mean, if you take the time, introduce yourself, and don't even try to sell them anything up front. I mean, maybe you have some programs you could talk about, but I mean, just work with them a few years and figure them out. And then that's what I've noticed when they start coming to me and saying, hey, I do have this corner, this strip that could be used in perennial habitat, but I just think relationships are super important.
No, it is, and I think you think about how that farm landscape used to look with more farm families on each section, right?
Mm-hmm.
And everybody knew their neighbors.
Sure.
And so I think there's a understanding among that segment of society that those relationships are important, and I mean they were important, sometimes life-saving, important in some cases back in the day. But that as those people get further from their next neighbor, now with fewer farms out there on the landscape, I think they're looking for that. They're a little hesitant when somebody new shows up, like you're suggesting. But I think it's still ingrained in us that collaborations and partnerships can help us survive as a species, right?
Mm-hmm, sure.
And so that's something we look for, is and that increases that your capacity if you're convinced that this person is going to be a help to you rather than a hindrance.
Yeah. And I think my experience here of late with the Prairie Strip program, CP43, is kind of a good analogy of that. It takes time. It takes about 3 years to really start seeing that prairie emerge. And that speaks to that relationship from the landowners. Like, you can't just expect you're going to convert somebody overnight to implementing it. So back to your point, you're building trust that you're going to be there. You can help support them through that process. So you're a trusted listener. You can come in and engage with them. And then that, as you build that relationship, that's really, and in a lot of, unfortunately, we as humans, I like to have that little Staples easy button. We want it to be easy, very simple.
Yep.
But in reality, it's not. It's complex and it takes time. And I think that sometimes we get caught up in we got to have it now, instantaneous, and we want it really simple. But in reality, it's just building relationships and connections. And as you build those connections, then that can help, and continue to expand. Oh, hey, my neighbor down the way here, they were talking to me the other day about this conservation opportunity. Would you mind going and stopping down there and chatting with them? So kind of building those relationships. They know they can trust you and rely on you.
Yep.
Yeah, and I think that's another point that you said, listening, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what the on-farm research program does well,
Yeah.
is that they listen to what the producer wants to look at. I mean, not all the time. Sometimes the extension educator has what they want to look at and they'll implement it on the farm, but sometimes it's just the farmer coming in and saying, hey, I want to look at this rate of fertilizer versus this, and then just see how it works on my field. So as we move into the future, do you think that on-farm research is going to play a bigger role in the next 10 to 20 years?
Yeah, and I think in general, those the partnerships. One of the Farm Bill programs, I think there's 2 Farm Bill programs that are going to be a bigger deal in the future. One is CSP, which allows you to still be producing,
Sure.
still it's working lands. You're still producing crops, right? But you're around the edges, build into the landscape. You've got conservation design, landscape design principles that are saving some soil and protecting the water and providing for some wildlife habitat. And then the other one is the RCPP, the big partnership program, that is these regional conservation partnerships that are that often have an NGO, an agency, and then a group of farmers that are, so you're impacting more than one farm, and so I think those types of things are what. So I think we're going to see more of those in the future. The other reason is, from a federal government perspective, they're efficient because there's not as much money that goes to each individual farmer in that case. And with the RCPP, you're actually leveraging some other funds from these other agencies and things that have a ball in the game too. So I think the evidence-based research, in concert with kind of these spatial focus areas and partnerships out on the landscape, are a big, that'd be my prediction for the future. If we come back 5 years from now, we'll see more of those happening.
Yeah, and I would argue that, very similarly, I think that what you hear out there as well is the interest in the co-creation of science. So co-creation with your farmers, your partners like Pheasants Forever or Game and Parks here in Nebraska or other state, federal NGO organizations. We're all kind of working together, and especially from the producer standpoint. So it's not like they can walk with you through that process. There is no kind of black box perspective of like you just go in and collect the data on their property and then you come back 4 years later and here's some information, about what we did. And so I think it's really important that we walk with people, because I think that also builds that trust, that process, and you're working with them, understanding their resource concerns. And then to me, it also facilitates future projects as well, because you're working with them along that conservation journey of what are these issues they're dealing with day to day and how can we find solutions. And that to me is really speaks back to the land grant, mission, and having those kind of three, areas of focus: research, teaching, and extension.
And I think the other thing I would underscore there is, even just like the two of you doing this podcast together, there are not enough people in extension to walk with every producer out there on the landscape. There's not enough Pheasants Forever biologists to work with every. So as a conservation community, there's a great cartoon from the 1930s, early 40s. Ding Darling wrote all these. He actually was a chief with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but he was a cartoonist, and he had at the time there was all these early conservation groups, and he has like in one pane, every one of them has their own kettle of soup, and they're trying to, they've got their own fire with their own kettle of soup, and they're all scattered out around the little area, trying to get their soup going. And then the second pane is there's one big pot of soup, and everybody's put their wood underneath it. And he says, now we're cooking with gas, right? And so that's at the time there were actually some conflicts between those conservation organizations. Like, you don't want to join that one because they do that, So I think we're past that today, but I think that same theme still persists, that the value of working together across our agencies and NGOs and the university.
We did that last year, the Conservation Connecting Points workshop, and that's the idea is continue to facilitate those types of opportunities for collaboration that can then generate, new ideas and, new partnerships that can go out and address a lot of these really interesting questions we have. So thinking about that future, as the director of SNR, moving forward into the future, where do you feel, training for our, students that are coming through here is going to, need to go? Maybe areas we're already doing really well, which we have a lot of great areas we're doing really well in, but just kind of thinking about the future and, needs that we may have out there from, engagement you've had with partners or farmers or others.
Yeah, I think one of the steps that I can see going back 2 decades that we're making a lot of progress on that I'm happy with is the inclusion of agencies, NGOs, and things in some of our courses. We have people helping with our wildlife field techniques course, that are they come in and show the students, and it's a good opportunity for those folks, our partners, to see our students. They might be hiring one of these folks someday, but at the same time, it also shows our students like what's important to these agencies and what's the difference between this Prairie Conservation Agency and the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission and Pheasants Forever. Like they all have, different missions, and so which one of those is more aligned with like what I want to do in the. So I think that's an important thing, is to make sure that our students are exposed to those agencies who are working with the private landowners. I think it's important when it's possible to get students engaged and understand that dynamic out there with private landowners too. And so, you and I have had a lot of conversations about, it's not just about the biology. I had a learning experience early in my career where I learned that it wasn't just about what I could show you how to produce pheasants, because the next year a lot of people took their land out of CRP because the corn prices went sky high. And so it's not just about, we need to keep teaching good science courses and good ecology courses and good habitat courses and stuff. But it's also about that understanding those dynamics, and so we need to make sure that our students are are exposed to that, so that when they go up to maybe they get a job with Pheasants Forever someday, and they're knocking on that door, they understand, and they're just not completely naive as to what situation they're getting into.
Yeah, that's good. And then you had a major that you, if I'm not mistaken, or a program you started was a master's. It was was that applied science?
Master of Applied Science in
Yeah.
Conservation Agriculture.
Yeah, it's just one other way to kind of think about those
Yeah.
connection points so that you can get, students experience in kind of the ag realm, but also the conservation realm. Because like you said, we need biology. We need to understand that, understand the ecology of the species, but we also need to at least have some background. Not saying you have to be an expert in ag economics, but, you have to have some idea about some of these different things. And then thinking about that connection point back to the landowners, if you're going out and you are a private lands biologist, you're working with that landowner, how can you start some conversations with them? How can you begin that process of building trust so that maybe some of those individuals, those farmers you're working with, will become your champion farmers in the landscape, and they can basically take that message back to their peers? Because really, that's a lot of I think about with my extension program is I can provide people the tools. Ultimately, it's the producers, the champion farmers out there. They're the ones that are going to sell conservation. They're going to be able to tell their peers about it, because they live there with them in that community. You talked about it earlier with having the smaller farms, the more networks, obviously, and that's how we have to be able to advance it, collectively. So.
No, we need to do more creative things on the curriculum side at the university to provide what people need, and that unique master's program in conservation agriculture is an example of a non-thesis master. So you're not going to go on to get a PhD after you take that, but if you're just going to go out, if you're going to go out and work on the landscape, what better master's degree to do this non-thesis thing in conservation agriculture, where you may not need as much statistics and research experience as you do to write a thesis in another type of master's. And then we have the certificate that's a whole separate certification for students that you can come back even after you have a bachelor's degree and get this wildlife habitat management certificate. And I think we'll have more of those types of things to provide professional development for people out in the landscape that are working in conservation too.
Yeah, no, that's really good.
So for students that are getting ready to graduate or going through school, what are some words of advice that you have for them? Because obviously you've been in your position, you've worked in this area of research for quite a while, so conservation and working lands. Just so it's not all doom and gloom, what are some words of advice for them?
Well, we just had our, back in early May, we just had our graduation for the environmental science and regional community forestry and fisheries and wildlife students that graduated here from the School of Natural Resources. We have a little ceremony to kind of personalize things in addition to the university's graduation ceremony. And the message I had there was that, at the moment, there's a lot of people that are losing. Like there's not as many federal jobs open, just in this dynamic of the current landscape of job opportunities, right? But there's a whole world of other things that are actually burgeoning right now, which includes some of the positions like you're talking about, where that you work in with are these NGOs that are, I talk to Andy all the time. I can probably guess that there's around 200 people in the state of Nebraska, which included some of the NRCS biologists too. But so some of those were federal, but the majority of those are people working with landowners that work with the Sand Hills Task Force, that work with Game and Parks Commission, that work with Pheasants Forever, that work for other NGOs that are hiring the Nebraska Grazing Lands Coalition. Just like a lot of these and 5-10 years ago, those positions weren't there.
Sure.
And so that's a dynamic of growth that I see. And I think it responds to needs that those organizations see. Consulting firms are also hiring a lot of people. So these ecological and environmental consulting firms that you see in Lincoln and Omaha and other larger towns around, we're trying to make sure that we're sending students to those folks that have the curriculum that they need as well. So I really think there are a lot of opportunities. And I told them our stakeholders, are coming to the School of Natural Resources asking for support more than ever before.
That's awesome.
And so if that drives, if demand drives things like we're talking about with Marcus earlier, right? Then eventually things are going to turn around because the people actually want what we're selling here. To be like a little weird about it, but if you want help with water and soils and biodiversity, and if you don't want to use climate, but if you want to use severe weather, if you're worried about severe weather, there's a lot of folks that are worried about their erosion impacts from heavy rains and droughts, the risk of drought. People are coming to us to talk about that. So I think the future is bright for people that have an interest in working in those spaces.
Yeah, no, and that's good. And as we kind of get towards the end here, that was kind of one of the things I wanted to just briefly highlight is kind of thinking about the trade-off and kind of, historically we've kind of looked at conservation as a trade-off. Oh, I'm losing land from conservation, but we can think about it as a strategic asset, and that's where those students can help out and kind of taking new ideas out there and new technologies. Talk to my colleagues over in Ag Hort Department, talk a lot about precision ag technologies, think about how do we optimize these systems more efficiently. Kind of thinking the landscape design perspective, I think that's really important. It's not just about putting habitat out there, but it's putting it out there in the strategic locations where it needs to be at, and to really have the maximum efficiency, knowing that we're not going to go back to the early 1900s or even before then, when you had large intact prairies on the landscape in a lot of these areas. That's just not realistic under the current situation. So I think it's really important to think about, as you mentioned, weather is a component of that. We have an initiative here, Weather Ready Farms is something that UNL has, UNL Extension. That's basically working with producers to get their farms weather ready. They go through a whole certification program, and they learn a lot about the process, do some different training modules, and that helps them get prepared for, what happens if I have a massive flood? How can I address that? And I was on a producer's farm last Monday, and it was really a great, kind of story to think about and to kind of wrap this up. Is that we were standing on the hill, we were looking out, and his neighbor was having to replant because he said they had just gotten like 3 inches of rain the week before within just, a few short hours, and it flooded a lot of his fields out. And he said, one of the things that's been really interesting to me is I'm looking at my operation. I've been implementing conservation practices, and I haven't had to do those type of things. And I thought that was really a powerful message coming from an individual who's thinking about, here's where conservation practices can really help me and my operation, because now I don't necessarily have that extra stress. And again, that's not to put anybody else down for making those other decisions, but the point is that they are an opportunity. They're strategic help to you so you can address some of those uncertainties like weather that you're not going to be able to predict, and now you can help optimize your farm in an efficient manner.
Right.
So
yeah, no, just to plug the book one more time, that one of the statements I make in the book is that there was a period of time, and maybe we go back to the 50s, where just like pheasants and grassland birds kind of came along for the ride. If we were farming like everybody else was farming, we had grassland birds. There were pastures. There were small grains. We had pheasants. And things have changed on our landscapes to the point where those things don't come along for the ride anymore. And so it has to be a purposeful decision about how we're going to design our farm and how your neighbor designs their farm to make sure that if we want pheasants, if that's a goal, if we want grassland birds, then how do we design our farm to make sure that those things do come along? And so that means having other goals besides just profitability. It used to be that the profitability goal was just fine because the way farms were designed, those things came along for free. But now they don't come along for free, and so you've got to figure out ways to think about those a little more. And I think that's important as we head toward the future.
Yeah. That's really good.
Yeah. And with that, what has continued to inspire you to continue your work all these years?
Sure. Well, I think that I used to have a phrase, landscapes for tomorrow was kind of my little catchphrase. And somebody corrected me once and said, well, you need your landscapes for today too, Larkin. So we'll amend that. And I think I actually used that phrase when I applied for the director position, that, the vision was to have the School of Natural Resources supporting landscapes in Nebraska and the region for today and tomorrow. And I think that's thinking about that tomorrow. I've got a son. If you've got children, you can think about what we're leaving them. If you don't have children, you can think about what you're leaving your young neighbors or something. And so I think that legacy that we leave, that the landscape that we're leaving them, is the thing that kind of inspires me just to keep going, because I think we'd like to leave the world in a better place than we found it, if you want to use that corny phrase. And so I think that's the inspiration for me to keep going, is to be a part of that purposeful and needed discussion about how do we make sure that our landscapes are better and are there for the resources that we need for our working landscapes.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to wrap it up and put a bow on it. So I know you're extremely busy and all of your work running SNR, but I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to come talk with us.
Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess one last thing, when's that book going to be published?
So I think we'll say by early fall.
Okay.
So
right.
And the book's called The Best of Intentions, A Story of Landscape Change in the Heart of the Great Plains. So
okay.
It's for sale here I know you can find it here at the School of Natural Resources Maps and More store sometime early fall.
Have to get a copy and get your signature on it.
There we are. Well, it has a lot of old pictures in it. I went around the state to historical archives and things. So even if you find books boring, this one has a lot of pictures to look at. So
that's my kind of book.
That's good. Yeah. No, that's awesome. Well, yeah, thanks again, Larkin. I really appreciate it. Appreciate you joining us today. And this has been a great conversation about conservation and working landscapes.
Thanks, guys.
So, all right. Thanks.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
Are you enjoying the Wild Ag Podcast? You or your organization can sponsor upcoming episodes that bring important information to listeners just like you. To learn more, visit our website, go.unl.edu/wildag.
Wild Ag is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network. If you enjoy this podcast, please leave us a review so others can find us and tune in.
And we want to hear from you. You can submit questions or topic suggestions to us at wildagpodcast@gmail.com. That's WILDAG podcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.